So we're talking about metadata, which is data about data. And today we want to look at types of metadata. So one of my favorite things is creating taxonomies. So let's look at a taxonomy for types of metadata. We're going to have 6 types of metadata. The first is the entity metadata. So that describes the dataset product owner. I'd say product owner because we don't want to say owner, because the owner of the data might be different to the entity that is collecting that data and putting it into a data set. So entity metadata items are things like who publishes and maintains the data set, what sort of institution are they, their contact information, their location, and so on. Our main thing we think of with metadata is descriptive metadata, and that's the metadata that describes the data set. It might have a title. Here it would talk about who contributed or where that data was sourced from. It gives an abstract, maybe tags and keywords, the geographic coverage of the data set, the time period, that sort of thing. We have catalog metadata. Catalog metadata is the sort of metadata that helps for the data set to be included in, say, an open data catalog or in a proprietary catalog as well. So, it might include unique identifiers, the version numbers, the publication date, and so on. Reference metadata is data that explains how the data set was created. So it's sort of all your background information about your data set. If you're looking at the fitness for purpose for a data set, or you want to judge whether it's of sufficiently high quality, you'd look at the reference metadata, which would explain things like the methodologies used for collecting the data and processing the data, any known limitations. The sort of things, when we do reference metadata, we include a couple of additional fields. We include things like applicability or fitness for purpose. Some data, for example, might have been used in one location or one province which had a very specific population size and geographic population head density, and that might not be applicable then to a urban environment with a higher density or something like that. So you want to sort of spell out some of those sorts of considerations if you're looking at reference metadata, and we always include an analysis of how the data set might be useful for equity analysis and comparison, and how you use the data set or what limitations are involved in the data set if you're looking at reducing, say, health inequalities or social inequalities. Then the structural metadata is metadata that explains the standards and the data structures that were used in that data set. So it's things like, what standards were used, units of measurement, any links to data dictionaries. You can include links to crosswalks if you have them, or even to tutorials about how those data models were applied to your data set. The administrative data set is data about managing the data set. So here it's things like the terms of use and the licensing requirements. So really important around explaining who can use the data set, how they're allowed to use it, how they're allowed to change it, or so on. Often we also see some operational details included for IT professionals who might be using the data set to be able to understand file formats, storage requirements, system dependencies, and so on. So they're the 6 areas where we look at the types of metadata. So that's the ideal set. Of course, you're not going to have all of that for every data set that you're working on. So out of that, you're going to choose some of those elements for different for different data sets, and we'll have a complete description on our website of the different metadata data models and all of the fields that you could have in each of those. We'll talk about that more in future videos as well. For me, what I would see as a minimum metadata would be details about the entity, including contact information, descriptive data, including who the data sources are. We often see in some work we did with World Health Organization, we found that those in low and middle income countries who were contributing data to the research pool often weren't then invited in to participate as health researchers when that project was being done in a high income country in Europe. And so by having that area where you're explaining the data sources, hopefully you're going to be able to give some give some acknowledgement of those original sources and maybe invite them in a little bit more. We also see it in other areas like the European deforestation regulation, which requires that farms submit data, and you really want to be able to have that feedback loop so that if that data is used for enhancing market access or so on, then there's some way for you to start being able to let those who contributed that data know that there is interest in market opportunities for using that data. You know, it's sort of it's a data justice principle that I would encourage you to think about. Structural data I would also include so that people understand for interoperability how to use the data, especially if you're not doing the catalog metadata. Structural data is really important. And then finally, from the administrative data, I would include the licensing and terms of use. That's the overview of the types of metadata and the taxonomy we use for describing metadata, and we'll have more in the series. Thanks for joining me.